That wreck is yours now. Graham Whitcomb smiled as the lawyer slid the brass keys across the table. Nolan Mercer, a 41-year-old veteran, didn't reach for them. Nora wanted me to see it first. Nora felt sorry for Strays, Graham said. His eyes dropped to Valor, the German shepherd lying by Nolan's boots. The dog stood. The room went quiet. The old lawyer opened one envelope. She left one instruction, he said. Do not sell until Valor finds what I hid. Graham laughed. Nolan didn't. 6 days later, that ruined farmhouse would make a millionaire beg for answers. But 90 minutes earlier, Nolan still thought he had inherited nothing. Nolan Mercer did not expect to inherit anything worth keeping. At 41, he had learned not to expect much from rooms where polished people gathered around polished tables and spoke in careful voices about money. He sat in the back corner of Arthur Bell's law office in Hollow Creek, North Carolina, wearing a charcoal jacket that still carried the faint crease of old storage, his hands folded so tightly between his knees that his knuckles had gone pale. Beside him, Valor lay motionless on the worn oak floor, a black and tan German shepherd with silver beginning to frost the fur around his muzzle. The dog's body looked calm, but his eyes were awake, sharp and steady, tracking every breath in the room. Across from Nolan sat Graham Whitcomb, Nora's nephew, a man who looked as if life had never asked him to wait outside a locked door. Graham's navy suit fit perfectly. His shoes shone. His phone rested face down beside him, though every few minutes his fingers drifted toward it out of habit. He had come prepared to receive. Nolan had come prepared to be forgotten. The old lawyer adjusted his glasses and opened the thick cream-colored folder in front of him. The office smelled of dust, lemon furniture polish, and rain warming on the sidewalk outside. It was late May, and beyond the blinds, Hollow Creek moved slowly through a damp southern afternoon, the kind where thunder sat far off in the hills without yet deciding whether to arrive. "Thank you both for coming," Mr. Bell said. His voice had the weight of a man who had carried other people's final words for too many years. Graham gave a polite nod. Nolan said nothing. Valor's ears twitched once. The first part of the will went exactly as everyone expected. Graham received the lake house near Lake Wiley, including its furnishings, 2 vehicles, several investment accounts, and financial assets totaling approximately $1,700,000. Mr. Bell read the numbers without expression, but the room changed anyway. Graham leaned back almost imperceptibly, the smallest smile touching the corner of his mouth. Not greed exactly, certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from a life arranged to confirm what a man already believes about himself. Nolan looked down at Valor and felt the old familiar hollowness open inside his chest. He was not jealous of the money. That surprised him less than it might have years ago. What hurt was simpler, quieter. Nora had been the one person who never made him feel like an afterthought. Now even her final wishes seemed to place him at the edge of the room again, where he had stood for most of his life. Mr. Bell turned another page. "To Nolan Mercer," he continued, and Graham's eyes shifted, amused before the sentence was finished. Nolan lifted his head. Valor did too. "I leave the property located at 286 Briar Hollow Road, Hollow Creek, North Carolina, including the farmhouse, barn, surrounding land, all structures, documents, tools, books, furnishings, and contents therein." Silence settled over the office, then stretched thin. Graham exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh. "Briar Hollow," he said. "That place is still standing?" Mr. Bell did not look up. "It is." Graham turned toward Nolan with a smile that belonged more to pity than kindness. "Well, congratulations, you got yourself a roof that already gave up." Nolan felt heat rise behind his ears, but he kept his face still. There were things a man learned in uniform, and one of them was how to let a careless sentence pass without giving it the dignity of impact. But Valor did not look away. The German shepherd raised his head higher and fixed his amber eyes on Graham, not threatening, not restless, only deeply present. The room seemed to notice. Graham's smile weakened. Mr. Bell reached into a drawer and withdrew a large manila envelope, thick with age, its corners softened and its flap sealed with Nora Whitcomb's careful handwriting. Nolan's name was written across the front, not Mr. Mercer, not beneficiary. Just Nolan. Under it, in smaller letters, were 4 words, "He will understand later." Mr. Bell placed the envelope on the table, then laid a ring of old brass keys beside it. The moment metal touched wood, Valor's body changed. It was subtle, but Nolan saw it. The dog's nose lifted. his ears angled forward. A tremor of attention traveled through him, the way it used to before a command, before a door opened, before the world revealed what it had been hiding. Nolan picked up the oldest key, its bow worn smooth by fingers that were no longer alive. Valor stood. No bark, no whine, just a sudden, solemn readiness. Nolan looked at him, then at the envelope, then at Mr. Bell. The lawyer's face had softened in a way that made him seem older. "Your aunt was very clear," he said quietly. "No one was to sell that property before you saw it for yourself." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the courthouse square. Graham checked his watch, already finished with the place, the house, the man, and perhaps even Nora herself. But Nolan could not move. The key lay heavy in his palm, warmer than it should have been, and for the first time all afternoon he felt something other than loss. Not hope, not yet. Something smaller, a tug, a question. A door waiting in the dark. 2 days before the keys touched the lawyer's desk, Nolan Mercer stood beneath a leaning sycamore at Hollow Creek Cemetery and tried to remember how to breathe like an ordinary man. The rain had stopped just before the service, leaving the grass bright and slick, each blade holding a bead of water that caught the weak May sunlight. It was not cold. That almost made the morning worse. Winter would have given the grief a shape, something hard and white and mercifully numb. But summer pressed in softly from every side. Damp earth, cut grass, honeysuckle along the stone wall, a chorus of cicadas rising from the trees as if the world had the nerve to keep living. Nora Whitcomb's casket rested beneath a canopy of white fabric, surrounded by pale yellow roses and a few mason jars filled with wildflowers from her own garden. Nolan stood near the back, not because anyone had asked him to, but because old habits have roots. He had spent enough years in uniform learning where to stand, how much space to take, when to speak, when to disappear. Valor sat at his left knee, still as a carved shadow, his leash loose in Nolan's hand. Every now and then the German shepherd leaned his shoulder against Nolan's leg. Not enough to demand attention, only enough to remind him that he was not entirely alone. Graham Whitcomb stood closer to the casket, surrounded by neighbors, cousins, old church friends, and people who seemed to know exactly what to do with their hands. They touched shoulders, they bowed heads, they murmured about Nora's kindness, her stubbornness, the way she remembered birthdays, the way she could make blackberry cobbler without measuring a thing. Nolan listened from a distance and felt each memory land like something borrowed. Nora had not raised him. She had not been required to love him. She had entered his life late, after his discharge, after the long months when he slept badly and answered questions with half sentences, after the world began calling him former, as if the best and worst of him had already happened. He had come to Hollow Creek for a records appointment and left with an invitation to dinner he did not know how to refuse. Nora had lived alone then, in a small brick house with blue shutters and a porch swing that complained softly in the wind. She had not asked him what haunted him. She had not told him to be strong. She had simply poured coffee into a chipped mug and said, "You don't have to earn a place at my table, Nolan. You just have to sit down." It was the kind of sentence a man could carry for years without admitting it had saved him. Later, when Valor retired from service, and Nolan wondered whether he could care for a dog who seemed to understand too much, Nora had looked at the shepherd with those clear gray eyes of hers and smiled. "That dog still believes you're worth following," she had said. "Maybe you should start believing it too." Now she was gone, lowered into a silence that no discipline could answer. The minister spoke gently about faith, memory, and the road home, but Nolan heard only pieces. A bird calling from the fence. A car passing beyond the cemetery road. Valor's quiet breath. The soft sound of Graham accepting condolences with the polished sorrow of a man who knew people were watching. Nolan hated himself for noticing. Grief should have made him generous. Instead, it made him small and raw. When the final prayer ended, people began drifting away in slow clusters. Several passed Nolan without recognizing him. One woman touched his sleeve and said, "She thought highly of you," then seemed embarrassed by the intimacy of her own words. Nolan nodded, because speaking would have broken something loose. When the cemetery nearly emptied, he stepped forward at last. The roses trembled in the humid breeze. He placed his palm lightly on the edge of the casket, then took it away as if he had touched a door that would not open. Valor rose and lowered his head beside him. For a moment, man and dog stood there together, both trained in different ways to keep watch over what could not be kept. Nolan swallowed hard. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," he whispered. The wind moved through the sycamore leaves above him, soft and restless, almost like an answer arriving too early to understand. By the time Nolan Mercer walked into Arthur Bell's office, the rain had returned in a thin silver sheet, tapping softly against the second-floor windows, like fingers asking to be let in. Hollow Creek's old courthouse square looked blurred beyond the glass, its brick storefronts and slow-moving traffic softened by weather. But inside the law office, everything felt too clear, too still. The room had a long table, 4 leather chairs, a brass lamp with a green shade, and shelves crowded with estate files that seemed to lean under the weight of other families' endings. Nolan took the chair nearest the door. Valor settled beside him immediately, shoulder against Nolan's boot, his dark body tucked close, as if he understood that some rooms did not need noise to feel dangerous. Graham Whitcomb arrived 8 minutes late and apologized in a tone that somehow made lateness sound like a favor. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and rain on wool. "Nolan," he said, offering a hand. Nolan shook it. Graham's grip was warm, confident, brief. "Good to see you." There was nothing cruel in his voice, and somehow that made it worse. Cruelty at least admitted what it was. This was politeness with a locked door behind it. Mr. Bell waited until Graham sat, then opened Nora's will. His hands moved carefully over the pages as if he were touching something still alive. He read first about donations, a modest gift to the Hollow Creek Historical Society, a scholarship fund for adult vocational training, money set aside for the church roof, and enough to keep the town library's archive room open for another year. Graham's smile tightened at each line. Not enough for anyone to accuse him of impatience, but enough for Nolan to see it. Then came Graham's name. Lake Wiley residence, fully furnished. 2 vehicles. Investment accounts, personal valuables. Financial assets totaling approximately $1,700,000. Graham lowered his eyes, but his mouth betrayed him. A small, satisfied curve appeared and vanished. Nolan stared at the tabletop, following a scratch in the wood with his eyes. He told himself he felt nothing. He had slept in barracks, tents, motel rooms, and once in his pickup outside a closed rest stop in Tennessee. He did not need a lake house. He did not need a boat dock or polished floors or framed views of morning water. But beneath that reasonable thought was a smaller one, bruised and stubborn. Nora had seen him, hadn't she? Mr. Bell turned the page. "To Nolan James Mercer, I leave my property at 286 Briar Hollow Road, Hollow Creek, North Carolina, including farmhouse, barns, surrounding land, all structures, furnishings, tools, books, documents, and contents therein." Graham looked up. "Briar Hollow?" He gave a soft laugh, then caught himself too late. "Sorry, I just didn't know that place was still legally habitable." "Mr." Bell's eyes lifted. "The will does not describe it as habitable, it describes it as his." Nolan felt Valor shift beside him. Not restless. Alert. The shepherd's ears angled toward the lawyer's desk, toward the manila envelope waiting there beneath a paperweight. Graham leaned back, folding his hands. "Well, it's land. Someone might take it off your hands." The words were smooth, even helpful, but Nolan heard what sat underneath them. "You will not know what to do with it." Mr. Bell slid the envelope across the table. "Mrs. Whitcomb instructed that this be given to you unopened." Nolan reached for it. His fingers hesitated over Nora's handwriting, and for one foolish second he expected the paper to feel like her hand. It did not. It was only paper, heavy, yellowed real. Beside it Mr. Bell placed a ring of brass keys. One was long and old-fashioned, worn almost soft at the edges. Valor stood at once. The movement was quiet, but everyone noticed. Graham looked down with mild discomfort. "That dog all right?" Nolan kept his hand on the keys. Valor's gaze remained fixed on them, his nostrils working, his body composed but charged with purpose. Mr. Bell closed the folder. "Nora said the house would explain itself better than any of us could." For the first time that afternoon, Nolan looked directly at the old lawyer. "Did she tell you why me?" Mr. Bell took off his glasses and folded them slowly. "She said Graham would know the price of the place." His voice softened. "And you would know when something had been left behind for a reason." Nolan did not open Nora's envelope in the parking lot. He sat there for a while with the engine off, listening to rain tick against the roof of his old pickup and watching people hurry along the courthouse sidewalk with newspapers held over their heads. Graham left first, stepping into a black SUV that looked too clean for a town with muddy shoulders and gravel drives. Before the door closed, he glanced once toward Nolan's truck, not with anger, not even with triumph, but with the mild curiosity a man might give an abandoned building before deciding it was someone else's problem. Nolan waited until the SUV disappeared around the square. Only then did he breathe out. Valor sat in the passenger seat, upright and watchful, his damp nose pointed toward the manila envelope on Nolan's lap. "You know something I don't?" Nolan asked quietly. Valor did not move. His silence felt less like an absence and more like patience. Nolan drove back to his rented place behind Dempsey's Auto Repair, a narrow apartment over a storage bay where the walls shook every morning when mechanics raised the garage doors. It was not much, but for 3 years it had been enough. A bed, a table, 2 mugs, a shelf of military manuals he no longer opened, and a square of rug where Valor slept with one ear always turned toward the door. That evening the rain passed, leaving the air wet and golden. Nolan climbed the stairs, fed Valor, hung his jacket over a chair, and finally opened his laptop to check the one thing he had been avoiding all day. The email was brief. Due to budget restructuring, position eliminated. Final paycheck issued Friday. Thank you for your service to the County Veterans Records Office. He read it once, then again. The words did not shout. They did not need to. They simply removed the floor beneath him with the clean efficiency of an administrative decision. Nolan lowered himself onto the kitchen chair. Across the room, Valor stopped eating. The shepherd turned, studied him, then came over and placed his chin on Nolan's knee. That small weight almost undid him. Not the inheritance, not Graham's laugh, not even losing the job, though he needed it more than he had admitted. It was the quiet mercy of being noticed by a creature who could not fix anything and stayed anyway. Nolan covered his face with one hand. For years he had been praised for endurance, for staying composed, for carrying weight without complaint. No one ever told him what to do when the weight had nowhere left to go. After a long time he reached for Nora's envelope. Inside were old documents, a deed for the Briar Hollow property, a hand-drawn map, a folded tax record, and a faded photograph of Nora standing on the farmhouse porch beside a man in uniform Nolan did not recognize. The farmhouse behind them looked tired even then, but alive, with curtains in the windows and vines climbing the porch rails. On the back of the photograph, Nora had written in blue ink, "Someday, this place will remind you that service does not end when the uniform comes off." Nolan stared at the sentence until the room blurred. He could almost hear her voice, steady and plain, never sweet in a way that asked to be thanked. Valor lifted his head and sniffed the photograph, then gave a soft breath through his nose, as if accepting an order older than both of them. Nolan looked around the apartment, the unwashed mug, the unpaid electric bill beneath a magnet, the cardboard box he had never unpacked because some part of him had never believed he would stay. Maybe Graham was right. Maybe Briar Hollow was a collapsing roof and a field of weeds. Maybe it was nothing but a burden dressed up as a gift. But Nora had protected it. She had written his name on that envelope. She had trusted him with something, even if he did not yet understand what. The next morning, before the sun cleared the trees, Nolan packed 2 duffel bags, his service records, a toolbox, Valor's food, and the old brass keys. He locked the apartment behind him without looking back. Valor jumped into the truck and settled beside him, calm as a soldier returning to the road. Nolan turned the key in the ignition. "All right," he said, his voice rough from little sleep. "Let's go see what she left us." The road to Briar Hollow did not look like a road at first. It began as a county lane outside Hollow Creek, past a shuttered feed store and a white chapel with a crooked bell tower, then narrowed until the painted lines disappeared and the pavement gave itself over to gravel, red clay, and weeds brushing the truck doors. Late May had dressed the land in green so thick it felt almost secretive. Kudzu curled over fence posts. Wild blackberry canes crowded the ditches. The air coming through Nolan's half-open window smelled of wet leaves, warm soil, and honeysuckle blooming somewhere beyond sight. Valor sat beside him without sleeping, ears up, eyes forward, as if the old shepherd understood they were not simply visiting a place. They were answering it. Nolan followed Nora's hand-drawn map past a rusted mailbox, over a narrow creek bridge, and up a slow rise lined with oak trees. At the top, the farmhouse appeared. For a moment, he took his foot off the gas. Briar Hollow Farmhouse stood at the end of the drive like something that had waited too long to be remembered. The white paint had peeled away in wide, tired strips. One side of the porch sagged toward the earth. The tin roof was mottled with rust, and vines had climbed the western wall almost to the second-floor windows. Behind it, a barn leaned slightly under the weight of its own years. Its red boards faded to the color of old brick dust. A stone well sat near the yard, capped and circled with grass. Beyond that, fields rolled back toward a line of pines, soft and still beneath the hazy Carolina sky. Nolan shut off the engine but did not get out right away. He could hear Graham's voice in his head, a roof that already gave up. Looking at the house now, Nolan could not entirely disagree. It looked less inherited than survived. Valor, however, had no interest in judgment. The German shepherd stepped down from the truck as soon as Nolan opened the door and moved toward the porch, with a slow certainty that made the hairs rise along Nolan's arms. He did not run. He did not sniff around randomly. He walked straight to the front steps, paused at the first board, then looked back once, waiting. "You been here before, old man," Nolan murmured. Valor only climbed. The porch groaned under their combined weight, but held. Nolan slid the long brass key into the lock. It resisted at first, then turned with a dry click that sounded louder than it should have in the heavy afternoon. When the door opened, the house exhaled. Dust, cedar, old paper, lavender gone faint with age, and something deeper underneath, not rot, not mildew, but the closed-up breath of rooms that had kept their own counsel for years. Sunlight entered in thin gold lines through lace curtains, revealing a front parlor draped in white sheets. Shapes of furniture slept beneath them like ghosts that had decided to be polite. Nolan stepped inside, boots careful on the pine floor. Valor crossed the threshold beside him and stopped, head lifted. The house creaked softly around them. Not the sharp complaint of collapse, but the low settling of a body waking from a long sleep. Nolan moved from room to room. In the kitchen, a blue enamel kettle sat on the stove, dull with dust. A row of empty glass jars lined the windowsill, catching the afternoon light. In the study, books bowed on their shelves, their spines faded by years of sun. A cracked leather chair faced the window as if someone had just stood up and promised to return. The pantry smelled of dried herbs and old wood. There Valor stopped. His body went still in a way Nolan knew well. Not fear, recognition. The shepherd faced the back wall, nose working along the seam behind a tall shelf, then sat down as if the matter had been decided. Nolan frowned. "What is it?" Valor did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the wall. Nolan ran his hand over the boards and found nothing but dust and splinters. "Probably mice," he said, though neither of them believed it. Evening settled slowly. Nolan carried in his bags, opened windows, found that the water pump still coughed to life after several stubborn tries, and spread an old blanket across the parlor sofa. He ate crackers and peanut butter for dinner, while Valor lay facing the pantry door. Outside, frogs began calling from the creek bed. The fields darkened. The farmhouse seemed less empty with every passing hour, not because Nolan understood it, but because it had begun to make room for him. Near midnight, he woke to a sound he could not place, a soft tick inside the walls. Valor stood in the hallway, silver muzzle pointed toward the kitchen, waiting. Nolan listened, heart steady but awake. The house was speaking in its old language. And for the first time in years, he wondered if he might be ready to listen. Morning came soft and green through the upstairs windows, spilling over the farmhouse in slow bands of light. Nolan woke on the parlor sofa with one arm numb beneath him and the taste of old dust in his throat. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then the ceiling above him came into focus. Cracked plaster, a faint water stain shaped like a coastline, a spiderweb trembling in the corner where a breeze slipped through the screen. Valor was already awake. The German shepherd stood at the kitchen threshold, still as a question, staring toward the pantry. Nolan pushed himself upright and rubbed both hands over his face. "You planning to tell me what's back there?" he asked. Valor's tail moved once, not wagging, simply acknowledging that the conversation had begun. Nolan spent the morning opening windows, sweeping mouse droppings from the baseboards, and carrying brittle cardboard boxes out of the study. The house resisted being cleaned at first. Every drawer stuck. Every floorboard answered with a complaint. Yet the longer he worked, the more he felt the place shifting around him, less like a ruin, and more like an old person clearing their throat before speaking. In the study, Behind a row of farming manuals, Nolan found a leather-bound ledger wedged sideways against the wall. When he pulled it free, something slipped from between the pages and sailed to the floor. It was a folded sheet, yellow at the edges, brittle enough that he held his breath while opening it. A floor plan. Not a professional blueprint, but a careful hand-drawn map of Briar Hollow Farmhouse, each room labeled in Nora's familiar handwriting. Parlor, kitchen, study, back stairs, pantry, cellar access. Nolan carried it to the dining table and smoothed it beneath his palms. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The house on paper matched the house around him, right down to the crooked hallway and the narrow storage closet under the stairs. Then his eyes found the pantry. Behind it, drawn in faint dotted lines, was a small rectangle with no door, no label, no explanation. Nolan looked up slowly. Valor had left the kitchen threshold and was now standing beside him, nose hovering over the paper. The dog sniffed once, then turned and walked straight to the pantry, as if the map had not revealed anything to him he did not already know. Nolan followed with the strange obedience of a man no longer sure who was leading whom. Inside the pantry, the air was cooler. Rows of empty shelves lined the walls, their surfaces stained with circles left by jars long gone. Valor stopped before the back wall and pressed his nose against a vertical seam Nolan had missed the night before. The boards were old pine, darkened by time, but one plank sat a fraction higher than the rest. Nolan ran his fingers along the edge. Dust broke loose and drifted in the narrow light. "You found this before I did," he whispered. Valor sat down, calm and solemn. Nolan fetched his toolbox from the truck. He worked slowly, afraid of damaging whatever Nora had protected. The first nails came free with soft metallic sighs. Then a second plank loosened, then a third. Behind them was not insulation or brick, but darkness. A narrow passage, no wider than a closet door, breathed cool air into the pantry. Nolan stood back. His pulse had not raced like this in years. Not from fear, but from the sudden knowledge that the ordinary world had a hidden room inside it. He took a flashlight, bent low, and stepped through. Valor followed close enough that Nolan could feel the dog's breath against his leg. The space beyond opened wider than expected. Shelves climbed from floor to ceiling. Boxes sat stacked beneath oilcloth covers. Photographs hung from twine with wooden clips. Journals, letters, maps, service records, newspaper clippings, and bundles of handwritten pages filled the room with a silence so dense it felt inhabited. In the center stood a small oak table. On it lay a single journal, its leather cover cracked, its first page marked by a blue ribbon. Nolan opened it carefully. The name inside read Thomas Whitcomb, 1919. Beneath it, in faded ink, someone had written, "For those who came home and were never asked what it cost." Nolan lowered himself into the chair. The room blurred, not from dust this time, but from recognition. Valor rested beside him, head high, eyes reflecting the flashlight like twin embers. Nolan had thought Nora left him a broken farmhouse. Now, surrounded by voices saved from forgetting, he understood she had left him a door. Nolan did not leave the hidden room until the afternoon light had shifted across the pantry floor and turned the dust in the air the color of old honey. He had meant only to look around, to understand enough to make sense of the space, but the room did not allow a quick understanding. It asked for patience. It asked for a chair pulled close, for clean hands, for silence that did not rush the dead. Valor seemed to know this before Nolan did. The German shepherd lay beside the oak table, front paws crossed, silvered muzzle resting near a stack of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Whenever Nolan reached for another journal, Valor lifted his eyes, not demanding, only present, as if standing watch over every voice waiting its turn. The first journal belonged to Thomas Whitcomb, a railway clerk who came back to Hollow Creek in 1919 and spent the rest of his life writing down the names of men who returned from service and never spoke much about it. Nolan read slowly. The handwriting was narrow and controlled, but grief pressed through the ink in places where sentences stopped too soon. Thomas had not written like a hero. He had written like a man, afraid that ordinary sorrow would vanish if no one bothered to record it. In another box, Nolan found ledgers from a woman named Lillian Gray, who ran the town's boarding house during the Depression. She had kept accounts in pencil, but beside many unpaid balances she had written one word: forgiven, not erased, not ignored. Forgiven. Nolan touched those pages carefully, feeling the strange force of mercy made practical. Mercy written in columns beside flour, coffee, shoe repairs, and lamp oil. There were photographs, too. A mail carrier standing knee-deep in floodwater with a canvas bag over one shoulder. A nurse outside the old clinic, sleeves rolled up, eyes tired but steady. A carpenter beside a rebuilt porch after a hurricane, his hands resting shyly on the railing, as if embarrassed to be photographed for doing what he believed anyone should do. Farmers, switchboard operators, mechanics, cooks, widows, veterans, neighbors with names history would have stepped over if Nora had not placed them here and shut the wall behind them. By evening, Nolan understood one thing clearly. This was not a treasure room in the way Graham would mean it. There were no gold bars, no hidden certificates promising sudden wealth, no painting worth millions beneath the dust, and yet he felt richer with every box he opened, though not in a way he knew how to explain. These records were proof that dignity had lived in Hollow Creek quietly, stubbornly, without applause. They said a person's worth could not be measured only by what they owned, what they earned, or how loudly the town remembered their name. Later that night, Nolan found the bill of sale for Briar Hollow Farmhouse. Nora had bought it in 1998 for $43,000. Folded with it was a note in her handwriting. Bought to keep it whole. Some things should not be scattered just because no one knows how to price them. Nolan sat back, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. For years he had feared becoming one of those scattered things, useful once, then filed away, thanked politely, and forgotten. The thought came so quietly it surprised him with its force. Valor rose, crossed the room, and pressed his head beneath Nolan's palm. Nolan let his fingers rest in the thick fur between the dog's ears. She knew, he whispered. She knew what this place was. The next morning, Graham called. Nolan stood on the porch while the fields steamed under the early sun, and Valor watched a pair of cardinals move through the fence line. Graham's voice came smooth and practical through the phone. He had spoken with the developer. The land might be worth $80,000 as is, maybe more if Nolan moved quickly. You don't want to get buried in repairs, Graham said. Let somebody clean it up. Nolan looked through the open front door toward the pantry, toward the hidden room behind it, toward shelves filled with lives that had waited decades to be treated as more than clutter. The answer rose in him without anger. That was new. No, he said. Graham paused. No, Nolan watched Valor turn his head toward him, amber eyes calm, certain. This place isn't empty, Nolan said, and it isn't for sale. After he hung up, the farmhouse seemed to settle around him, not like a burden dropping onto his shoulders, but like a hand resting there with trust. For 3 days, Nolan lived by the rhythm of the house. Morning light in the study, coffee on the porch, dust on his sleeves. Valor's slow footsteps moving from room to room as if checking on the old place, making sure a secret remained where it belonged until Nolan was ready for it. The hidden room had changed him in ways he could feel but not yet name. He no longer walked through Briar Hollow like a man inspecting damage. He moved carefully now, almost respectfully, closing drawers with both hands, brushing dust from photographs, reading names aloud so the silence would not swallow them again. Still, there was one door he had not opened. The cellar sat beneath the back stairs, locked behind a narrow wooden door with swollen edges and a brass knob darkened by age. Nolan had tried the main key, then 2 smaller ones, then decided not to force it. Some rooms, he was learning, had to invite you in. On the 4th evening, a warm rain began falling over Hollow Creek, soft at first, then steady enough to drum against the tin roof and blur the fields beyond the porch. Nolan was at the dining table reading a folder of Nora's notes when Valor rose from beside him. The shepherd did not bark. He never wasted sound. He crossed the kitchen, stopped at the cellar door, and looked back. Nolan felt that familiar tightening behind his ribs, not fear exactly, but the old instinct that told him the air had changed. Again, he said softly. Valor placed one paw against the bottom of the door. Nolan went to the counter where the brass keys lay in a chipped saucer. One small key remained untested, nearly black with tarnish, its teeth worn delicate as lace. This time, when he slid it into the cellar lock, it turned. The door opened with a damp sigh. Cool air breathed up from below, carrying the smell of stone, earth, and time held underground. Nolan clicked on his flashlight. Valor descended first, slow and sure, each paw careful on the wooden steps. The cellar was larger than Nolan expected. built from fieldstone and heavy beams, with shelves of empty jars along one wall and a workbench beneath a low window clouded with dirt. In the far corner stood a tall cabinet covered by a canvas dropcloth. Valor walked straight to it and sat. Nolan pulled the cloth away. Behind the cabinet, set into the stone, was a small iron safe. Its face was plain, its dial stiff with age. Nolan tried the obvious numbers first. Nora's birth year, the year she bought Briar Hollow, the street number. Nothing. Rain whispered through the window well. Valor shifted beside him, and the metal tag on his collar clicked softly against the buckle. Nolan looked down. The tag was old, one he had never replaced because Nora had once said it carried history. Stamped beneath Valor's name was V17. Nolan remembered the day Nora had cooked pot roast because Valor's retirement papers had been finalized. July 17th. She had called it the day a good soldier came home. Nolan turned the dial 071. 7. The safe opened. For a moment he could not move. Inside lay a sealed envelope, a leather photo album, several legal documents, and a folder marked Briar Hollow Living Archive. Nolan lifted the envelope first. His name was written across it in Nora's hand. "Dear Nolan," the letter began, "if you have found this, then Valor has done what I trusted him to do." He reached the bottom stair and sat there, unable to stand while reading. Nora wrote that Briar Hollow was never meant for the richest heir, nor the loudest, nor the one most certain he deserved it. It was meant for the one who would listen before deciding what something was worth. She wrote about men and women who had built lives out of duty no newspaper praised, about people who served quietly and were forgotten politely, about the danger of measuring human value by usefulness alone. Then the words turned toward him, gentle but unflinching. "You have spent too long believing you must be needed to matter. You matter before you are useful. You matter when you are tired. You matter when you have nothing left to prove." Nolan pressed the page against his knee, his breath uneven. Valor came close and rested his head in Nolan's lap, warm, solid, patient. In the safe was also a trust of $120,000, enough to begin repairs, enough to keep the house whole. Not wealth, a beginning. Nolan looked around the cellar, at the safe, the rain-streaked window, the dog who had led him there, and understood at last that Nora had not left him a burden. She had left him a way back to himself. By the following Monday, Nolan had stopped asking whether he was qualified to save Briar Hollow and started asking where to begin. The question still frightened him, but it no longer emptied him. It gave shape to his mornings. He made coffee before sunrise, opened the hidden room to let in air, and sat on the porch with Valor, while mist lifted from the fields like a curtain being drawn back. The farmhouse needed more than sentiment. It needed roofing estimates, moisture control, archival boxes, pest treatment, electrical inspection, and hands steadier than his own. So Nolan called the Hollow Creek Historical Society and asked for Mara Collins, whose name he had found in Nora's notes beside 3 underlined words, "She will understand." Mara arrived that afternoon in a dusty gray Subaru with a canvas satchel, rolled sleeves, and the patient eyes of someone who had spent years listening to old paper tell the truth slowly. She was 38, maybe 39, with dark hair pinned carelessly at the back of her neck and a pencil tucked behind one ear. Valor met her at the porch steps. He did not bark. He sniffed her hand once, then stepped aside. Mara looked down at him and smiled. "Well," she said, "I suppose I've been approved." Nolan almost smiled back. Almost. Inside, he showed her the hidden room, the journals, the photographs, the letters, the cellar safe, Nora's folder labeled Briar Hollow Living Archive. Mara did not rush to touch anything. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, one hand pressed lightly to her chest, as if she had entered a chapel by accident. "Nora told me she had materials," she whispered. "She did not tell me she had a town's conscience behind a pantry wall." Nolan looked away, uncomfortable with the size of what he had inherited. "I don't know how to do this right." Mara turned to him, her expression gentle but firm. "Then we do it carefully. That's usually better than confidently." Over the next weeks, Briar Hollow changed by inches. Not in the dramatic way Graham would have understood, with demolition crews and new paint covering every scar, but in small acts of respect. Acid-free folders replaced brittle envelopes. Names were indexed, photographs were scanned. The study became a reading room with a repaired window and 2 lamps Nora had kept wrapped in newspaper. The barn, once leaning and dim, was cleaned and opened into a workshop space where local retirees, nurses, mechanics, postal workers, clerks, and veterans could bring letters, tools, uniforms, recipes, ledgers, and stories they had assumed no one wanted. Nolan noticed how people arrived apologizing. "Sorry, this probably isn't important. Sorry, it's just my father's notebook. Sorry, it's only a photograph from the old mill." Each time Mara would say, "Let's look at it." And Nolan began saying it too. Valor became the quiet host of Briar Hollow. He lay near the porch rail when visitors came, his chin on his paws, his amber eyes soft but attentive. Some people spoke more easily, with the shepherd beside them, than they did across from Nolan. He understood that. Dogs did not measure pauses. They did not correct memory. They did not hurry grief into something useful. One afternoon, Graham returned with a developer, walking through the front yard in pressed slacks, as if the grass itself had inconvenienced him. He offered $250,000 for the land, said the farmhouse could be repurposed, said the location had potential. Nolan listened without interrupting. Valor stood beside him, calm as a shadow in sunlight. When Graham finished, Nolan looked back at the open doors, at Mara labeling boxes in the study, at the shelves of rescued names, at the porch boards he had repaired one plank at a time. "You're still seeing acreage," Nolan said. "I'm seeing lives." Graham's face tightened, but only for a second. Then something uncertain passed through it, something almost like embarrassment. He left without another offer. That evening, Nolan placed a small wooden sign beside the front walk, "Briar Hollow Living Archive." Underneath, in smaller letters, he carved Nora's words from the folder. "Every person deserves to be remembered with dignity." Valor sniffed the sign, then leaned his shoulder against Nolan's leg. The farmhouse stood quiet in the gold light, no longer waiting to be saved, but beginning, at last, to serve. 1 year later, Briar Hollow no longer looked like a place waiting to be erased. The farmhouse still carried its age, and Nolan had insisted on that. The porch boards had been repaired, not replaced unless they had to be. The white paint was fresh, but thin enough to let the old grain show through in places, like lines on a face that had earned the right to keep them. Lavender grew again beside the front steps. Rosemary and mint filled the kitchen garden Nora had once planned in careful pencil. The barn doors opened smoothly now, though they still gave a low, familiar groan each morning, a sound Nolan had come to love, because it reminded him that restoration did not mean pretending time had never passed. On the first Saturday in June, people gathered at Briar Hollow for the archive's public opening, not a grand ceremony. Nora would have hated that. Just folding chairs under the oak trees, iced tea sweating in glass pitchers, a few microphones that kept crackling, and a long table covered with photographs, letters, tools, ledgers, and names that had spent too many years behind a wall. Valor lay on his woven mat near the porch, his muzzle grayer now, his breathing slower, but his eyes as steady as ever. Every visitor seemed to greet him first. Nolan watched from the edge of the yard, uncomfortable in a clean shirt Mara had made him iron twice. He had planned to say very little. Thank everyone for coming. Thank the Historical Society. Thank the volunteers. Point them toward the reading room. Step away. That was the whole plan. But when Mara introduced him and the small crowd turned in his direction, Nolan felt the old instinct rise in him. Retreat, minimize, let someone else carry the moment. Then Valor lifted his head. Not dramatically, just enough. The shepherd's amber eyes found Nolan across the yard, calm and expectant, as if he were reminding him of the first day at the lawyer's office, the first night in the house, the cellar stairs, the safe, the letter. Nolan walked to the microphone. For a second, all he heard was the wind moving through the oak leaves. "When I first came here," he began, "I thought I had inherited what nobody else wanted." A few people smiled gently. Graham Whitcomb stood near the back, hands in his pockets, quieter than Nolan had ever seen him. "I saw a damaged roof, bad wiring, a barn leaning toward the ground, and a lot of work I didn't think I was strong enough to do." Nolan paused, looking toward the farmhouse. But Nora saw something else. She saw stories. She saw people who had held this town together without asking to be honored for it. She saw service in ordinary clothes. His voice tightened, but did not break. And she trusted me to learn the difference between something old and something worthless. No one clapped right away. That was how Nolan knew they had heard him. After the ceremony, Graham approached while Mara led guests through the reading room. For a moment, neither man spoke. The old distance between them was still there, but it had softened at the edges. "I thought she gave me the better inheritance," Graham said at last. Nolan looked at him carefully. Graham's eyes moved over the porch, the sign, the people reading names from old photographs. "Maybe she gave us both what we needed," Nolan said. Graham swallowed, then nodded once. It was not an apology wrapped in perfect words, but it was something honest, and Nolan had learned not to dismiss small honest things. Near sunset, after everyone left, Nolan walked through the hidden room alone. The shelves were clean now, the journals protected, the photographs labeled. In the center of the room hung a framed copy of Nora's note. "Every person deserves to be remembered with dignity." Valor followed him in and lowered himself beside the oak table with a tired sigh. Nolan knelt and rested one hand on the dog's silvered head. "You found it first," he whispered. Outside, the farmhouse glowed in the last gold of evening. It had not made Nolan rich. It had done something harder. It had given him work that healed instead of consumed, silence that listened instead of judged, and a place where the forgotten could be welcomed back by name. He turned off the lamp but left the door open. Some rooms once found should never be hidden again. If this story touched your heart, take a second to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories about loyalty, healing, and second chances. Which moments stayed with you the most? And where are you watching from today?